Good evening, everyone. You probably gathered that today is our 50th anniversary celebration, and we felt it was helpful to share a highlight of the last 50 years and thinking forward to the next 50 years. So we hope you enjoyed the messages in the video as much as we enjoyed making them for you and for others. I'm Professor Tom Robinson. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Head of the College of Life Sciences, and it's my honour to be your host for tonight's Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture. I've had the privilege of knowing Professor Sir Chris Whitty since his time as Head of the National Institute of Health and Social Care Research when he was my boss at the time that I was the NIHR National Specialty Lead for Stroke. Of course, we all feel that we know Professor Whitty from his presence in our homes most evenings as he presented the scientific evidence, its balanced interpretation, and the implications for our everyday lives during the COVID pandemic in his role as England's Chief Medical Officer and the UK Government's Chief Medical Advisors, roles that he has held since 2019. More recently, our own medical students were able to hear Chris's sage advice when he shared the stage with them as he received the honorary degree of Doctor of Science at the university's summer graduation. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you our Chancellor, Professor Dame Maddie Adrin-Pocock, under whose auspices this lecture is taking place. Dame Maggie is an award-winning space scientist, broadcaster and author who joined the university as Chancellor in March 2023. She is best known for her work on The Sky at Night, which she has presented since 2014. She has a distinguished career in industry, academia, media and public outreach, and she is a trailblazer in many respects. By becoming Chancellor of the University of Leicester, she broke the mould in the century-old history of this great university. She became the first woman to hold the title of Chancellor at Leicester. She became the university's first minority ethnic Chancellor. And she is the first Chancellor to have a Barbie doll fashioned in her honour. We are fortunate to have such an eminent figure as the ceremonial head of our university, as an advocate for Leicester, both nationally and internationally. I now invite Dame Maggie to formally open tonight's Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And Tom, thank you for your very kind words. And for those of you that are asking, unfortunately, I didn't bring my Barbie doll with me. But if you want to see her, she is available on the web. Now, I'm delighted to be back in Leicester for the Distinguished Lecture Series. And the clue is definitely in the title. These are lectures given by very distinguished people. We're talking about eminent visionaries, leaders in their own respective fields. Or as a space scientist might put it, they are truly stars and they are out of this world. Now, this is a special Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture because it marks the 50th anniversary of the University of Leicester's Medical School. And it was wonderful seeing that video showing just some of the wonderful highlights. And still 50 years in the bag, another 50 years to come, and they're going to be glorious. Now, a number of you have been taking part in those celebrations today. And since its foundation, you've been celebrating that event today. And it is a very important milestone. And so we are honoured to have you here, and you're all very welcome indeed. Now, I feel very honoured to be standing here today for another reason too. Now, it's quite interesting because I'm about to publish my autobiography, available in all good bookshops early next year. But as I look through my sort of early life and my early education, standing here in front of you, it's a far cry from what I was doing sitting at the back of a class when I was at school, with very few prospects for the future. I went to 13 different schools when I was growing up. I say this to some kids and they look at me and say, how naughty were you? Wasn't like that. I will explain sometime. But yes, my careers advisor didn't envisage a career for me as a scientist, a science communicator, and a business owner. But with help and support from my wonderful family and amazing teachers, I was able to thrive. And this is what I see here in Leicester. At this university, we change people's fortunes for the better. And the university connects with the world around it. And as we could see in that sort of video of the medical school, the benefits of higher education reach out into the community. We definitely create citizens of change. Now, the Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture Series was inaugurated in 2015 by the then Chancellor, Lord Bruce Grocott. and it was continued by my immediate predecessor, Lord Willits. Previous speakers have included a stellar array, including David Attenborough, Patricia Cornwall, Lord David Putnam, Lord Robert Winston, Lord David Willits, Lord Patrick Vallance, Sir Ian Diamond, Sir Vicky Ramakrishnan, and Dame Jocelyn Brunel, and most recently Alan Bailey. And tonight we have another eminent name to add to that amazing list, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, who is no stranger to the university. As Tom said earlier, he received an honorary degree earlier this summer. Tonight's lecture is entitled The Role of the State in Preventing Disease, and draws on Chris's significant experience as a leader looking after the nation's health. So without further ado, I hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maggie, and I'm really honoured to be able to giving this lecture, particularly after such distinguished people giving it before it, but also particularly on your 50th birthday. So happy birthday to those of you who work in the medical school. It is an outstanding institution and has done remarkable work both in providing doctors and in providing research which will improve the health of both the UK but also internationally in the future. So it's something I think hopefully you can really celebrate. The last time I had the privilege of giving a lecture in Leicester, I gave a very scientific one. This one, you'll be relieved to hear, is not. I'm going to talk about something which is where I tend to operate, which is in the borderline between medicine and public health on the one side and the state on the other, and what is the role of the state in improving health. Now, let me start off with this relatively optimistic slide. This is health since around about 1600. And for about 200 years, my profession took their fees and achieved virtually nothing. Life expectancy was stuck at around about 40 years. So here in Leicester, for example, if you went back to the 1850s, the life expectancy of people here was 37 years at that point. So most people in this audience are well beyond that stage, which is good. And over the time since about the 1860s, the life expectancy in the UK has gone up quite astonishingly. So if you look at the life expectancy in Leicester today, it's about twice what it was at the point that change started. And I expect that to continue, albeit on a slightly shallower slope over time. Quite a lot of this difference was made by health improvements driven by the state. A lot of it's also to do with medical treatments, a lot of it's also to do with many other areas, but state intervention has been quite a large part of that difference. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. And the question I wanted to pose, and then try and give my own answer, but everyone will have a slightly different answer to this, is where the state can do a lot of things to improve health, including things it's currently not doing. And the question is, where should it draw the line? What should the state do, and what should the state stay out of? And that's really the question this lecture is designed to address. So public health, preventative medicine, which is half of my trade, I'm also a jobbing NHS doctor, the principal aim of it is to extend healthy life so that people have health for the longest period of life you can manage. And the ideal is for people to live a long and happy and productive life. I've illustrated this with the late Queen, at that point a sprightly 94, and Colonel Tom Moore, Captain Tom Moore, who was at that point 100, two people who've contributed to society and continue to right into their late age. Because I do want to make clear that people, if we get this right, should remain healthy enough to have very happy and productive lives into old age. That really, in a sense, is the aim. And individual citizens, the medical profession, other health professionals, and the individuals all have responsibilities and things they can do to achieve this state. I'm going to look specifically in this talk about the state. And I'm going to capitalize it throughout just to make clear what I'm talking about, because state can be used in lots of different ways. Now, how you answer this question depends very significantly on at what point you are in history and to some extent on what discipline you belong to. So what I've illustrated this with, and I'm not going to go through the biographies of all of them, the people on this slide are all people who operated both as health professionals and in the state. And where they drew the boundary would have been very different. So John Locke, for example, who's in the middle, he's a doctor. Most people think of him as a political philosopher, but actually started off as a doctor. His view about the state, which is one of the most formative actually in British philosophy, was quite different to Florence Nightingale, which I put next to him, who was an incredibly efficient operator within a state environment, as well as being the founder of nursing. So where people actually put the boundary is going to vary very considerably depending on their time in history, and it's also to some extent going to depend based on their political philosophy. But for reasons I want to come on to, the politics is actually less important in my view than people often think it is. I think it's much less important in day-to-day decisions. So if we consider prevention, I'm not going to go into the details of public health, but there's two things I wanted to introduce which are fundamental public health concepts. And the first is the division between what's called secondary prevention. And in secondary prevention, you take an individual, you say, what are your risk factors? What diseases do you already have? What diseases are you likely to get based on things like your blood pressure and your cholesterol and a variety of other things, and you deal with that individual. And there's primary prevention, where you do something for the whole of society, aiming to reduce the risk to everybody, irrespective of whatever risk they've got. You're not making any individual judgments. That division is quite an important one in what I'm going to talk about. Prevention is achieved by both of those, and the reality, and the good reality, is that most people usually only go to the doctor when they're unwell. That is a good thing. GPs, primary care nurses and others, district nurses, many other pharmacists increasingly, and also some secondary care doctors will see an individual, they'll see their risk factors, and they'll try to bring those risk factors down so that someone has disease delayed as much as possible based on their individual risk. That is based on individual consent. They will have a chat with someone and they'll say, these drugs have these side effects and this benefit. Do you personally want to take them? And someone will then make that choice. The whole point about primary prevention, done at a national level, is you cannot choose. It's done to everybody or to nobody. And therefore, individual consent is not possible. And therefore, the consent is given by elected officials on behalf of society. That's the way that the system works in democratic countries. Obviously works rather differently in other ones. And this primary prevention, therefore, falls to the state. Now, in democracies, what happens, the role of the state must depend on what the view of the public is. And broadly, a politician who correctly judges where the public are and follows that will get re-elected, and one who doesn't will not. That's the way the system works. So they spend their time trying to work out where the public is. It's the job of specialists like me and many people in the audience to lay out to political leaders, these are the things you could do. Here are the technical advantages. Here's what's going to happen in terms of the numbers, pros and cons of these. And it is then the job of the political leaders, whether they're local councillors, whether they're national leaders, to actually then make the decision as to what will be done. Based on where they think the public are. And that is because individual consent is not possible. The second concept of public health I want to introduce, and this is the only other one I want to do, is the idea of the ladder of intervention. And the state can make interventions ranging from ones that are almost invisible to the public. So, for example, they can pay money to support science, to test out various possibilities, have almost no interactions unless people choose to go into trials. They can inform the public. Moving a little bit further up, they can engage with industry and have somewhere between a cosy chat and a row. They can go for mass voluntary programs where they can provide screening and vaccination, but individuals still choose to take that or not. No one's going to force them to. And then moving a bit more into state powers, they can put on nudge taxes. So, for example, put on small taxes to encourage people to have lower sugar. They can regulate, saying you can't sell this product unless it has this particular activity. They can tax it very heavily. We do that in some products. We can ban them, absolutely not possible. And we can make individuals subject to the criminal and the civil law. And the further you go up that, the greater the state powers the state is taking, and therefore you've got to be much more sure that the public are with you. So that's a really important, in a sense, conceptual point. And the tradition in the UK that the state should interfere as little as possible in the lives of citizens is a very long and honourable one. And it's on both the left and the right in politics. They express it differently. It's in the law. I've illustrated this Lord Sumption, KC, for example, who's very firmly of the view the state should interfere as little as possible. It's many newspaper commentators, in my experience, with quite varying degrees of consistency, depending whether they like the intervention or not. But all of them would accept there are some things that only the state can do. So the question is, does the state do it or not? Not can the state do it? The state in practice can, and has the legal power to. Within this, the set point of public and parliamentary opinion shifts over time. And people often think that their point in time is the end of history. And things that we currently believe is what people are going to believe from here on in. This is completely untrue. People will look back on what we believe now in 200 years' time, and they will think we are barbarians, in some ways that we can probably not currently predict. So I'm just going to go back in quite a long point in time just to illustrate this point about how it shifts. It was controversial, really very controversial, when it was first proposed that the state should prevent children under 10 being sold to go up chimneys to clean them. That was controversial. And for 100 years, it was accepted that many of those children would die and most of the remainder would be permanently crippled by that experience. But the feeling was it was an inappropriate interference with the expression of a private enterprise to stop these people selling these children so they would go up the chimney. That was considered to be an unreasonable thing to do. Now we look back on that and we think that is a bit odd. But that was the majority opinion. It went to Parliament multiple times, and multiple times it was knocked back. And it took a campaign of a century, and in the end a rather sentimental book called The Water Babies, to change public opinion to the point where actually an effective act was passed. And I'm just giving this as an example how we look back and say, how could they? But at the time this was completely normal discourse by civilized, sensible people in ordinary life. Now this is my central argument, and then the rest of the talk is really just illustrating this, and the next slide are the two central points. My view is that at any point in history, but this moves over time, the general public have three possible states. They believe that the state overwhelmingly expect the state will act to improve health, and if a government chooses not to do it, they will sack them at the next election. At the other extreme, they absolutely believe the state should not act, and they would consider it to be huge state overreach, and they will sack them at the next election if they try. And in between, there is a small slither where they're unsure, and that's where politics comes in. If I could just illustrate that, the second of those, if, for example, the state said, children can come to serious harm if they go rock climbing, therefore we're going to ban children from rock climbing, and whilst we're at it, it causes a lot of tooth decay if they have sweets, so we're going to ban sweets. I am very confident that government would fall. Because the view would be this is huge overreach by the state in the affairs of families and children, which people have done this for years. But there are situations where the public is split. So why do the public want the state to act? Where do they want the state to act? And in my view, the reason the public expect the state to act comes under broadly three headings. Importantly with these, although the individual examples change over time, the headings stay the same. I can find examples to illustrate these going back to Mesopotamian times pre-BC. So, in thousands of years ago, and certainly for most of these in hundreds of years ago. So, first of which is when a risk is shared across society. And a classic example of that are epidemics, infectious diseases, and air pollution. I'm going to illustrate all of these with examples, but I'm just giving you the framework. And in all of those, if I increase my risk, so I get an infection, I therefore increase the risk to everyone around me who also might get an infection. So a risk is shared. That's the first area where the state is expected by the public to act. The second is where there is a major power imbalance, for example, between a very powerful company and an individual worker, where the state is the only person who can actually, is the only thing which can actually, in a sense, balance the equation. And this, in my view, is the reason why the public almost invariably support things to reduce industrial injury, occupational diseases, industries based on addiction, where that was deliberate addiction, and industries which can be dangerous, like the car industry. Absolutely essential, but you need to have it regulated. And finally, the state has always been expected to act to defend the people who are seen as vulnerable in contemporary life. So that has always been children and usually been pregnant women. And if you fall into those categories, then the people generally expect the state to act. If you don't, the case is much less strong in the public mind. So let's give some examples of the histories of this. States have always intervened to reduce the impacts of epidemics, going back, as I say, thousands of years. So the quarantine laws, for example, that we basically used in the beginning of COVID, dated back to the Middle Ages. They were virtually identical. And they were introduced for the plague things, and we didn't really change them very much. The state has often acted forcefully to detain people who are sick so that they can't actually infect anybody else. And the penalties for breaking their isolation have got considerably more benign than they used to be. There were situations, some states, where if you broke your isolation, they would kill you. The state would kill you. So this is we certainly, fortunately, haven't done that for a long time now. And they have historically always banned trades that were seen as particularly high risk during epidemics, which include things like pubs. That's not a new idea. Things like hairdressers. That's not a new idea. That goes back to syphilis, back 400 years. And indeed, the commercial sex trade tends to be discouraged during this because for fairly obvious reasons. So the kind of things that people actually do are fairly stereotypical and have happened for hundreds of years. And they have a perfectly sensible evidential basis. Fortunately, science has allowed us to do less, and this I think people often underestimate. And the first startings of this was John Snow's understanding that cholera, which was the thing he was asked to intervene on, was caused by contaminated water. And he did this by a variety of very good, elegant epidemiological studies, which really can't be bettered, comparing different companies, mapping out disease. And this was because cholera was an absolutely massive threat to society at the time. 7 massive pandemics started in 1817. There's no cholera we can see much before that. The 7th is still ongoing, incidentally. Tens of millions of people have been killed by cholera. It's a really unpleasant disease, and it's not a great way to go, having seen it. And Snow mapped this onto mapped the cases onto a pump, and he very theatrically removed the pump handle to prove that he thought that this was the case. And not because of that, but his way of demonstrating that we needed to take action to make water considerably safer. This is not, however, just a London problem, and I think just worth noting in passing that in historical records, Leicester had the worst death rate from diarrheal diseases in children that has ever been recorded in the UK. Fortunately, that is a long time ago, but just to show that this is something which actually was a serious issue. So in the 1870s, by which stage we were improving water, for example, almost 18 children per 1,000 would die of diarrheal disease before they were 5 years old. And that was improved by improving the drains. So do the public support these kind of measures against pandemics and epidemics? And the answer is, on all the evidence, yes. So if you look at COVID, and you may have individual views about this, you probably will have individual views, incidentally probably tinged by historical bias. People look back and they say different things to what they said at the time. I can say that with confidence. But in the early 2020s, there were very severe curbs by the state on individuals in their liberty. That was a democratic choice made by democratically elected leaders and supported by Parliament. And YouGov, when it did the polling on this, showed there was over 90% support for this. These were draconian powers. All ages, all social groups, all political parties. This wasn't a fringe view, this was a universal view. Now, why was this? Because if you ask people, overwhelmingly, and I had this discussion with some of our more libertarian politicians, overwhelmingly, individuals would say, I'm intending to follow the rules. I don't need the law to make me have the law. So why do people want the law to come in? And the answer is, if you ask them, the next question is, will your neighbours do that? No. No, these fellas, can't trust them. So the point of the law was not to help individuals police themselves. It was to make sure that if I and my family are going to take these huge social and economic and other hits, that is not in vain. I want everyone else to do it as well. Because if I'm the only person doing it and everyone else is not doing it, then actually I'm the mug and the pandemic goes on. So the law was to make sure everybody did it on a level playing field. That was the logic of the law, which I think is often sometimes is very much lost. Because people realise that if I do everything great, but everyone else is taking big risks, then that is going to lead to the risk still being very high for me, my family, my friends, for elderly people I care about, and for wider society. And only the state is able to actually say to everybody, you cannot take that risk on behalf of everybody else. Only the state. No one else can by law. Only the state can impose lockdowns. Only the state can restrict travel. Only the state can underwrite furlough schemes so that actually if you do that, people are not going to come to as great an economic loss. So the state, either the state acts or no one acts. There isn't an alternative to those two situations. And interestingly, during the COVID period, there was a notable shift in where the public are in terms of who's responsible for your health. So the public has always said, quite rightly, that the person who has the biggest responsibility for their own health is the individual themselves. That's always been top of the range, that stayed top of the range. But the view about what the state should do, local government and the NHS, national government, went up during COVID. And I'm sorry that this has never been repeated since, because I'd actually like to know, has it got back down again? My view is it's probably gone down, but not quite to the same level. But this does show that views can shift over time. Although we've had a big pandemic, we actually have epidemics that the state is expected to act on the whole time. People, I think, forget them. I'm just putting some that reach the front page of the newspapers. Many more reach in the inside papers. But the national press finds epidemics very good at selling newspapers. That's why they put them on the front page. And that's because people find epidemics quite scary. And they want the state to stop them. The state has also long been seen as responsible for dealing with endemic diseases. These are not ones that come in big waves if they're dangerous enough. And the archetypal one of this was in fact leprosy, where in leprosy people were actually legally thrown out of society by a very formal process. Where by law they were no longer part of society, they were part of the leprosy society, but no one else. That was it. They were completely isolated. And the centre of this was, in fact, just to the north of Leicester. So St Mary and St Lazarus Hospital, founded around 1157, in Burton Lazars, the Lazars is a clue, that's an old word for leprosy, was the centre of all the leprosy hospitals in the UK. So you are responsible for a lot. It now looks like this field on the left is all that remains, but that was once where it was at leprosy-wise, and this is a rather nice head of someone who was living with what we now call Hansen's disease, leprosy, from that area. But other infections also, syphilis, for example, led to a major regulation in trade. The reason why surgeons are the superb human beings that they are today, I'm sure there are some surgeons, that's why I wanted to say that, was when syphilis came along, they were removed from the barbers, who were actually a much wealthier and much more highly distinguished group at that time. To be clear, things have changed. And that was because people didn't want the person who was clipping your beard to be someone who was also treating someone with syphilis next door. So that's an example of regulation of trade. And tuberculosis and fever hospitals were around for a long time. In fact, I suspect there are probably some in the near vicinity which have been turned to other uses. Now, science, I think there's probably a perception, if I ask the average person, is the state more or less draconian about these kind of public health things? Certainly if I asked any journalist from a number of well-known newspapers, they would say the state is getting a lot more draconian. They are completely wrong. And they are wrong because science has made infections much less dangerous than they were previously. So this is a very sad painting by L.S. Lowry from 1935. This is the fever van. A child would have, for example, scarlet fever. It was very, very common at that stage. That child would be forcibly isolated by the state. The state would come in the van. They would take the child away. They would burn all the child's furniture and toys and strip the wallpaper. And the child would be isolated in the hospital, not seeing anyone, including their parents, until they either died or recovered, because there was no treatment and there were no vaccines. So this was the state intervening very forcefully in a disease now because of medical science, which is much less dangerous, so the state does not need to. So this is an example where state powers actually have decreased because science have decreased the risk. Alongside these quite wide state things, the provision of mass vaccination programs. If there are any anti-vaxxers in the room, bad luck, you're wrong. This up here, this photo, is what not having vaccines, in this case for polio, looks like. All of these children in iron lungs for the rest of their lives. So this is something which we really need to take very seriously. And if you think about the range of diseases, vaccines provided by the state, supported by research from the state, have dealt with smallpox, polio, diphtheria, meningitis. These are astonishing achievements that these are no longer seen because of the combination of science and state provision. So this is a remarkable area. And again, if someone else is vaccinated around my children, then that reduces the risk for my children. So again, the state has a right to act in the view of the public because my intervention is someone else's intervention. And high coverage prevents disease for everyone, including, for example, people who've taken a vaccine, but the vaccine hasn't worked for them. But if 90% of the people around them have had the vaccine, still fine, usually, because that reduces the risk. The state has also historically always been expected to provide clean water because people have always seen that as a potential risk, right back to Roman times and before. And the great sewerage projects of the 19th century, which allowed cities like Leicester, London, Manchester, Liverpool to survive and expand, were done by the state and using state powers because they required pretty vigorous engineering, it has to be said, which was highly disruptive. Whether we'd get them through planning laws today is an interesting question. And these were some of the most important interventions we've ever had against things like cholera and typhoid. These weren't medical interventions, these were engineering interventions, state provided. Food gets into slightly more complicated ground. The principle that the state should regulate food to keep it safe from infections is very long-standing, again, going back centuries. And medieval cities had strict laws that you couldn't sell spoiled food, meaning things that were potentially infectious, although quite a few of them had a subsidiary clause that said you were allowed to sell them to foreigners. And when you come on to more recent debates, for example, on pasteurization, which protects children from TB, diphtheria, a whole bunch of different things, so staphylococcal diseases. When it was brucellosis, very importantly, when it was first brought in, it was actually very controversial that we should be pasteurizing the milk. Everyone accepted that children were getting TB, for example, from the milk. Over 1,000 children a year were estimated to have died from bovine TB. That was accepted as a fact. There was also pretty broad acceptance that pasteurization actually worked, in the sense it stopped the infection. But it was considered to be, and this is much more recent in history than I was talking about, so this is the 1920s through to the 50s, a potential interference with trade and unnatural. And therefore, it was probably better in the minds of some people, to keep it natural and have children dying than to have it unnatural and children don't die. Now, you might say that is very odd, but these are people who were alive in your grandparents' generation. And that was a perfectly reasonable thing for sensible, civilized people to think. This is why I say, what will people say about us in 200 years? Because I'm sure we will have things where they'll point to this and say, really? So very strong lobby against it, but little by little, the battle was won. And for those who are interested in public health, well worth reading the Hansard from the time, seeing how the arguments developed, and then seeing how they mirror some of the debates we have about other issues now. And they're all fundamentally about either naturalness or not wanting the state to overreach its powers. Becoming slightly more up to date, salmonella in eggs. Those of you who are old enough to remember this will remember this was a huge political issue. It did devastation to the poultry industry in England and the wider UK, led to the resignation of a minister. And here's a situation where, fortunately, it wasn't humans who were affected, but the mass culling of birds was the only way we could deal with this. And that was considered to be a reasonable thing. And fortunately, we managed to get superseded by a vaccine, which has managed to prevent that. So here the vaccine is protecting the poultry. And the last example from food I just wanted to give was just to show that although many of these infections will be imported or around the world, BSE in cattle leading to new variant CJD in humans was something which first occurred in this country. And again, the response had to be that large numbers of cattle were killed and all of the cattle byproducts were removed from the market to get on top of this. Had a very big impact on the cattle industry and caused very substantial alarm amongst parents of children in particular. So that's on infections. How about air pollution? Well, air pollution is exactly the same thing. There is a very broad political support for air pollution control measures. And that's because if someone upstream of me, upwind of me, it has a large factory producing stuff, or indeed has a rather badly functioning wood burner, then they may get the benefit, but everyone downwind of them is going to get the harm. It is incidentally not an accident that most of the wealthy areas of most cities in England are built on the west. Rich people have the smoke going up, and poor people live downwind of it. That historically is what has happened, and the same is true very often of industries. So there's huge political support for this. I've shown this in a sense by showing the front page support for this across the whole political spectrum of newspapers in the UK. This isn't a right-left question. Keeping polluting industries away from habitation has long been seen as a state responsibility. And the first example, certainly that I can find, was 1272. So I hope that's long enough for people to see this is not a new fad. Done by Edward I, who, for those who know the history, was no woke, milk and water kind of person, but this was seen as an important part of state responsibility. The biggest recent spur to action in the UK was the Great Smog of 1952 in London. Those of you who watched The Crown will see the effect of that. Very large numbers of people died over an incredibly short period of time. And this led by a few slight indirect Knights moves to the Clean Air Acts. And they've really dominated what's happened here, and air pollution has, as a result of that, improved very significantly. Why does this matter? Because air pollution causes strokes, heart disease, probably dementia, asthma in kids, poor lung development, lung cancer. The list of things that air pollution does are very serious. The Royal College of Physicians estimates that somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people a year still die of air pollution in the UK. Had we gone back 50 years, the number would be massively greater. That is almost entirely due to state powers. And the effects of the state decisions and better industry rules are seen here. This is sulfur dioxide, something which can cause asthma attacks, very bad asthma attacks and other problems. And just look what happened between the 1970s and now. An astonishing change. That's due to a combination of regulation by the state, followed by engineering responses that lead to improvements in what we do and a move away from coal. But sometimes industry, very often, I really want to be clear that industry has been the solution to a very large number of the public health problems we've talked about. Occasionally, we have industries who choose not to do that, and I'm going to illustrate this with two. And the first one is lead in petrol. So it was introduced by this guy, Thomas Migley, who really is not one of the great public health heroes, and opposed by the lady below, Alice Hamilton, who is one of the world's great public health heroes. And what she said when they brought lead into petrol by General Motors in the 1920s is, lead has been known to be toxic for millennia. Why are we doing this? And the answer was, there were other engineering ways that you could actually stop engines having what's called knocking, but they were old, and therefore they weren't patentable. And lead was patentable, the lead mechanism, so that's the reason the lead response was used. It was used for perfectly straightforward commercial reasons. Very clear warnings of toxicity, and for 3 decades, the industry managed to dominate the research that was done and basically buy up all the scientists working in this area, who amazingly found that all the lead you found in the air was background pollution, nothing to do with us. Sadly, lead has a huge effect on fetuses in particular. So fetuses that are exposed to lead can lead to low IQs. There's surprisingly quite a significant link to crime for a variety of reasons, and quite big issues around intellectual development. And the evidence began to accumulate as it was done independently. The restrictions began in the USA originally. And if you can see what happened to the lead that apparently was background lead, when the lead was removed from petrol, you can see it basically disappeared in children's blood. It was all coming from petrol. And the world did not cave in when we stopped using lead. We now have lead-free petrol everywhere, pretty well, there's a few exceptions. The final ban on 4-star was in 1998 here in the UK, although it was being phased down before that. So this is an example where unlike many of the other areas where the industry was actually the answer, this is one where the industry tried to fight, in a sense, the science. But here's an example, a much bigger example, where the industry has been the answer. This is looking at particulates, particulate matter, which is one form of pollution, and nitrogen oxides, which is another, in driving in Europe. And every few years, the European standard got tighter, so you couldn't sell a car unless it met it. And the companies would say, "Are you sure we can do this? It's going to make our industry uneconomic." And then the engineers did it. And if you now look at the tailpipe emissions from cars in the UK, they are substantially better than they were previously, really to a massive degree. And you can see how these things have changed with diesel coming down rather more slowly than petrol. But that has been a stunning achievement of engineering and a stunning achievement of industry. We should really take our hats off to when they don't cheat, which did happen a couple of times, rather shockingly. Roads also, I think, demonstrate how the multiple ways the state can intervene. So we have in the UK some of the safest roads in the world. Only a few Scandinavian countries really do better, and they are for a variety of reasons. But UK roads are very, very safe, relatively speaking. That's improved over time. If you went back to the 1960s, road traffic accidents killed a lot more people and injured a lot more people than they do today. And that's due to a combination of things. And I'm just showing this because it's showing how the state operates in lots of different ways. Car design, regulation, saying you must have a crumple zone. So if a car crashes into you, it's absorbed over in the bonnet. You must have, for example, airbags. That's regulation. So the regulation is from the state, the response is from the industry, the car gets safer. Then you have road design, lighting and maintenance. Designed by the state, delivered by the state, maintained by the state. The state does the whole thing, paid for out of general taxation. Then you have some rules which are not aimed at industry, they're based at individuals. Speed limits, driving tests, drink driving laws, and MOT tests. Now, why do the public put up with these? And the answer is, they don't want someone who's drunk driving a useless car too fast, driving on the same road as them and their family. So the point about this is that the state can insist that everybody has to follow these rules, and that makes it safer for everybody. So they were highly protective. And the only one that was controversial, which is why I've highlighted, is compulsory seatbelts. And that, for quite a long time, there's quite a strong view that it was an Englishman or Englishwoman's God-given right to drive without a seatbelt, and if they crashed and killed themselves, that was their choice. That was kind of the view, which is a perfectly legitimate view, actually. And then it became, the thing which changed people's minds was when it was an advertising campaign based on good data that showed if someone in the back seat was not strapped in, they would pitch forward and they would kill the person in the front seat. And the opinion changed. The point here is the state was not considered to be right to intervene on the individual risk, but if it was someone else's risk, the state did have a right to intervene, and people basically said that's fine. I'm simplifying a lot, a rather more complicated picture, but I'm just giving this as an example. The UK public also believes that the government should reduce the risk of going to work. Again, the UK has some of the safest working environments in the world by objective criteria. The chances that someone will go to work in the morning and not come home because of work-related injuries is A, very much lower than most other countries, and B, massively lower than it was 40, 50, 60 years ago, when there was really large amounts of industrial ill health. And this is because there's an imbalance of power. The employer and the employee are so unbalanced in their power that only the state can actually insist on this. And the people who did this were the much maligned and incredibly life-saving health and safety executive, who would actually come in and say, you cannot do these things in mining, you cannot do these things in building, and made it much safer for employees to do their job. There's also, for the same reason, support for state action against occupational cancers. There's a very famous one that's taught to all medical students because, of course, they're never going to see it, called Potts's disease of the scrotum. Don't go into the details. It's but it's unpleasant. And this was got by people who were chimney sweeps. So that's an example of a disease that only people with one particular industry got it. And the whole point of these rules was to make sure that occupational diseases like this disappeared. The industry could stay, but the risk of the disease went away. And probably only about 1% of cancers now in practice could be prevented by state powers, because the state essentially has taken them already. There are some examples. Asbestos, sadly, is still killing large numbers of people with mesothelioma because we banned it too late. The medical profession, incidentally, defended asbestos for quite a long period of time, saying that the disbenefits of mesothelioma, which they accepted, were outweighed by the benefits of preventing fires. And there were sort of Lancet editorials saying that. So this is not one of the ones where my profession covered itself in glory. And there is certainly the general acceptance by the public for regulating industries that depend on addiction, harm others, or harm children. And there's one industry in particular which does all three, and that is the tobacco industry. Lung cancer remains the commonest cause by a country mile of deaths of cancers in the UK. The great majority of those are done for profit by a small number of companies. They know they're going to kill people in an incredibly unpleasant way. They know they'll get strokes, heart disease, chronic obstructive airways disease, asthma in children. They know that, but the profits keep rolling in, so they keep on doing their thing. And why is it that this is a problem? Well, firstly, other people's smoke can kill. And we saw this really spectacularly, for example, when the indoor smoking ban came in, within 3 months, the number of people going into A&E with heart attacks was visibly different. You didn't have to torture the data across the country. Astonishing. And the shocking thing about this, on top of all the other shocking things, is that the basic model of the smoking industry was to go for children. They always said, no, we don't go for children. Just as I have to say, some of the vaping industry currently says, no, we only do things for ex-smokers, middle-aged ex-smokers. And you go along the high street and you see, well, you know what you see. The reason we know that the cigarette industry was doing this, despite saying it wasn't, is because court cases have forced them to release some of their internal documents that show they were deliberately targeting school children, always have been. That was the basic model. You addict a child, and then they're your customer for life, which will be shorter than it would have been otherwise. But that's the way they did it. Interestingly, 70% of smokers think that smoking should be banned in cars with children. That's smokers. So the public really strongly believe this. And I think it is important that we take on what has become an extraordinary inversion of truth by the cigarette industry, where they say it's about personal freedom. The whole basis of their model is addiction. The majority of people who smoke wish they did not smoke and are trying to stop and cannot because of addiction, and the company knows that. Lots of internal documents say that. So their whole model is to take choice away, and yet they've managed to make a case that they're a pro-choice industry, a quite astonishing inversion of the truth. And we need to take that argument on very forcefully. And then also in non-communicable diseases, or semi-communicable diseases and mass voluntary screening, I've taken the example of cervical cancer, which in fact is a communicable disease, breast cancer, bowel cancer, which, for example, which are not. That's really my summary for the areas where I think the state has always been expected to intervene. I'm just going to give a few of the more controversial areas at the end before I wrap up. So risk shared across society. My risk is your risk. That's the infections. That's the pollution. A major power imbalance. That's the cigarette industry addicting children. That's the heavy industry cutting corners on safety because it shaves a bit off the profit line at the expense of the risk of the lives of their things and protecting the most vulnerable. And on all of these, I actually do not think the public have any controversy about this. They just want us to get on and do it. What about the areas which don't fall into that? And I think a good example of this is on the cardiovascular diseases. So this is the big historical trend over the last 100 years-ish. And what you can see is infectious diseases, my area of trade, went right down, largely due to state action. State action in terms of drains and clean water, state action on vaccines, state action in terms of isolation facilities. That was the state that did that. The massive improvement we've seen in cardiovascular disease, a triumph of medicine, stroke and heart disease right down, is a combination of medical science and state action. So the reductions in air pollution, the reductions in smoking, for example, that's firmly the state. Improved stent design, that's the medical profession and science, and it's some combination of these that have achieved that. There are more controversial areas than I think, and I think we should face into them and not say they're all one side of the yes-no divide. The first controversial area is what is the role of the state in paying for and providing individual treatment across the, including secondary prevention. And in the UK, we have a pretty settled, not completely settled, political view that is supportive of the NHS funded out of general taxation. And we kind of think that's the normal way of doing things. But actually, every other country's got a different view. So I've worked in multiple countries, and each one of them has got a different model by which the state does or does not pay for this. And they all think their model is a perfectly reasonable model, plus or minus. So this is to make the point that in this area, politics really does matter. So how it's done in Switzerland, how it's done in China, how it's done in USA, how it's done in UK and France, all different from one another based on the political settlement. And if you look at this in general, there is a trend towards wealthier countries tending to provide more state-provided treatment, but it is a very loose correlation. For those who like correlation graphs, yeah, you can draw a line through that, but there's a massive scatter around it. So this is not it will inevitably move over time. It can be quite variable, and political and cultural traditions do really matter. But what should the state do about harmful health trends which are based on individual decisions? And this is the one where I think the political questions tend to be most important. And a good example of this is rising obesity. It's a major threat to health. It's probably the biggest area we're going backwards in the UK. We're going forwards in huge numbers of areas, but this is one of the ones we are not. Things are getting worse. And it's often driven by very heavy advertising from particular bits of the industry. The food industry is a huge industry, including bits that are massively pro-health and bits which are health indifferent. They're not doing it to harm people, but their model is one that is going to lead to greater obesity. And childhood obesity is a particular problem. Data came out last week which showed that yet again, the gap between rich children and poor children, to simplify, has got bigger. And yet again, the rates of obesity in children in year 6, that's around 10, has gone up. I consider that as an appalling situation because getting obesity down is, once people got a level of obesity, is very, very hard. And the idea, for example, we could put 18-year-olds on GLP-1 agonist drugs for the rest of their life strikes me as an appalling way of considering that as a solution. There's also a very strong link to deprivation. You know the map of Leicester better than I do. That map will map onto deprivation in terms of obesity. That's just the way it has been. And the state certainly pays for the consequences, which will be significant. So does the state have a role? Well, I think that the settled answer is probably yes for children, but there's a bit more of a mixed view. And just going back to the ladder of state intervention, we certainly support science on obesity. I don't think anyone has any problem with that. We inform the public about how you can do things, a variety of different interventions. We engage with the industry. I talk to the food industry quite regularly in different forms, and I consider that's part of my job and those of other things. And we've got as far as a nudge tax, which I'll come on to. We haven't got as far as heavy regulation, heavy taxation, and we certainly have not got as far as banning things to prevent obesity. We do for a variety of other reasons. So the revealed preference politically in the UK is to go about halfway up the ladder. And I think there's an interesting question, given the scale of the problem, whether actually there is an argument for saying to the public, should we go a bit further up? But that's a political choice. I do just want to give an example where we've managed as a society to make really quite a good intervention. And to be clear, this is an idea we nicked from Latin America. So we weren't the first people to come up with this, but it's a good idea, where we had a nudge tax for sugary drinks, sugary soft drinks, which children use a lot. And there was quite a lot of squeaking about it when it was first introduced by the Treasury. The result, in fact, was that almost all the big manufacturers just reformulated down the amount of sugar, so you could buy the same product but with less sugar in it, to avoid them having the tax situation coming in. And the result of that was that the amount of sugar in the diet that came out of this went down very substantially. Total sugar sales through this route went down 35%. That is a big difference for a large area of this, in all socioeconomic groups. And yet the amount of soft drinks which were sold, which is the blue line, so the dark blue line on the left is sugar going down, and on the right, in every one of the groups, the actual sales of these, in fact, went up. So industry had no disadvantage to this, and the amount of sugar went down. That is a good intervention. That has worked, in a sense, for everybody. But you can't always get it quite as neatly as that. Finally, as we are in a university, I do want to make a real clear view about the importance of science in this. Science actually allows us to target our interventions much more narrowly so that a smaller amount of state powers has the same effect, or the same amount of state powers has a bigger effect. That's a very good thing, I think, is a win all round. And I also, when I'm dealing in public with the government, I always in my mind have this triangle in my head. The difficulty of the intervention, which may be political difficulty, it's unpopular, at least within industry, the cost of it. Everyone reads the newspapers, you know that the government is not awash with money. So that's difficulty on the one side. The size of the benefit you're going to get and the strength of the evidence. And if you've got something where there's cast iron evidence, and the size of the effect is going to be very large, then political leaders can go out and sell it to the public because they can say this is going to be painful and difficult. Some bits of industry will not like this, but actually this is the right thing to do. This is what happened, for example, with the indoor smoking ban, and indeed with the bill that's going through on smoking and vaping at the moment. The public are highly supportive. Bits of industry don't like it, they've lobbied against it, but politicians can say the evidence base is rock solid. If you don't have good evidence base, don't expect to be able to do difficult things. And one of the first things I said to the new ministers as they came in is, you need to understand there are three groups of things you can do in public health. You can do things that are expensive, you can do things that are unpopular, and you can do things that don't work. Please don't do the third. The first two are difficult, and they are only really justifiable if you have strong evidence and a big enough effect to justify the hit that people are taking. Remarkable improvements in health, many causes, but state and use of state powers is certainly one of them. I've given my own view, and you can all have a different view about why and where I think the state individual liberty sort of boundaries at this point in time. It'll shift over time. It'll be different depending on your political environment. But my view is most of the time you can tell where the public will be definitely for, definitely against, or somewhere in the middle, and there's a genuine political debate to be had. Thank you very much.
So Chris, thank you very much. I think you can tell from the applause how much that was appreciated by the audience. Personally, for me, it brought my job together, health, and it brought my favourite reading material, history. So it hit both buttons there for me, and it was nice also to see some local examples, both the historic and Burton Lazars. I will now know what Lazars stands for, and of course, and what's very relevant now, obesity internationally, nationally, and as you've shown in Leicester. But I'll now hand over to the President and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Nishant Kandigraja, just to make closing remarks.
So the first thing I wanted to say is that hopefully you can all appreciate why we have this Chancellor Distinguished Lecture Series. Is one of the reasons where as a university we want to bring eminent scientists, researchers, authors to share interesting ideas and share with the public audience. And it has been a fantastic example, Chris. You've delivered on every aspect that we aim to have a successful Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture Series. And it's very easy for us to appreciate when somebody delivers well, but I can tell you it's very hard to put a public lecture like that. And Chris packed so much information in a very short presentation. And I can also tell you, having been many occasions, people tend to reuse what they have, but Chris made sure this is relevant to this audience and researched about Leicester. That is fantastic. I think everybody will agree. We could have stayed here for another half an hour listening to you. So can we give a massive round of applause to Sir Chris Whitty? And the other person I would like to briefly thank is our Chancellor herself. This lecture series, Chancellor's Lecture Series, and she was here last week for another event in the university for the Black History Month, and we are incredibly grateful. She's a very busy person, but she's always willing to give time for the university to front these events. We really appreciate Maggie for coming and chairing this session. Thank you very much. And finally, thank you all very much for coming. Without you, the lecture will not be successful. So I hope, and I'm sure you will agree, you all had a great time. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm sure you will go and tell other people how good the Chancellor Lecture Series are at Leicester. Thank you very much.